Did the disciples hallucinate when they claimed to see Jesus raised and alive from the dead? In this video, I'm going to give you 3 reasons that help you respond to one of the most common objections to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. This will allow you to engage with skeptical friends or people who may not have investigated the evidence for the resurrection. It'll also maybe give you confidence when you face and navigate your own doubts along the way. Hey everyone, Jonathan Morrow here, where I give you tools and training to understand culture and live out a biblical worldview. If you're enjoying these videos, I encourage you to give it a like and a subscribe and comment below. That really helps me get the word out and gets these videos before more and more people in this important topic about why Christianity is true and how it changes everything, because it is. So help me out with that. I really appreciate it. Also, be sure to stay to the end because I've got one bonus reason to help you understand why the resurrection makes so much sense, but it's a reason not a lot of people talk about, so you don't want to miss that. So let's dive right in. So did the disciples hallucinate when they claimed to see Jesus raised from the dead? Now, recently we've talked about other videos about Jesus. Did he claim to be God? We also talked about how you could prove that Jesus existed without a Bible verse. And we also talked about the 9 best reasons to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. But in this video, what I want to do is talk about one of the key objections to the idea that Jesus was actually bodily raised from the dead. And if you'll remember, the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. 1 Corinthians 15, written in the early 50s AD by the Apostle Paul to the church at Corinth, really puts a marker down, and it connects forever faith and history so that the claims of Christianity are bound together with the claims of history and whether or not Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. So one of the most common objections to the resurrection is the idea that the disciples hallucinated when they claimed to see Jesus raised from the dead. So what are we to make of that claim? To get the big idea about what's going on here, imagine this. You and your friends want to go on a fancy vacation to Hawaii. So here's what you do. You say, hey everybody, at 11 o'clock tonight, everybody go to bed, and I will see you in Honolulu in our dreams. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's ridiculous. Well, in many ways, that's the same thing that would have to be necessary in order to share in a group hallucination. You can't share in a group hallucination any more than you can share in a group dream. And psychologist Gary Sibsey, Dr. Gary Sibsey put it this way. He says, I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades and have yet to find a single documented case of a group hallucination. That is, an event for which more than one person purportedly shared in a visual or other sensory perception where there was clearly no external referent, meaning no one was really actually there. So the first big problem with the hallucination theory is that people don't have group hallucinations any more than they have group dreams. But there are some other problems with this objection to the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and here's the first one. Paul had no desire to see Jesus alive from the dead. Paul was not grieving. He hated Christians. You know, sometimes people say when you're grieving a loved one, sometimes they'll appear to you, or maybe you think you saw them because you really wanted to see them. But Paul does not fit this profile because he hated Christians. He persecuted Christians. He persecuted followers of Christ and people of the way. So the last person he wanted to see alive from the dead was Jesus of Nazareth. And yet he claimed to see Jesus raised from the dead, and ultimately went to his death for that belief. The next problem with the hallucination theory is this. Jesus appeared to different kinds of people at different times, places, and in different circumstances. How could they all share in the same hallucination? Again, there's a diverse population of people who claim to see Jesus raised from the dead in different times, places, and circumstances, and that would not fit what we know about what a hallucination actually is. And finally, the hallucination theory does nothing to explain the evidence for the empty tomb. As we've already talked about in previous videos, there's independent and strong evidence that the tomb was empty. One of those reasons is what's called the Jerusalem factor, the idea that the last place on the planet you would start a religion based on somebody being raised from the dead, if they really weren't raised from the dead, is in the very place that it happened. And that's what we see happening with the disciples proclaiming that Jesus was raised from the dead in Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus had been publicly executed by the Romans. So the Jerusalem factor supports the empty tomb. A second reason is what's called enemy attestation. The enemies, the Jewish leadership, said the disciples stole the body, which is an admission that there was no body to produce. If they wanted to disprove the idea that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, they could have produced him and said, hey, there's your risen Messiah right there, dead. Therefore, you get no Christian movement. And lastly, you have the evidence of the testimony of women whose legal status and testimony in that day was not very well respected. In fact, it was embarrassing in the first century, and you would not have led with that fact unless it really happened. If you were inventing that story, you would lead with Peter, the gung-ho apostle, finding the empty tomb of Jesus, but Peter was up in the upper room cowering away, and yet all four earliest biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all record a group of Jesus' women followers finding him and coming to the empty tomb, claiming that he was raised from the dead and seeing the risen Jesus. I love how N.T. Wright, the scholar of the resurrection of the Son of God, an excellent book on this topic, put it this way. He said, the widespread belief and practice of the early Christians is only explicable or explainable if we assume that they all believed that Jesus was bodily raised. In an Easter event, something like the stories the Gospels tell. The reason they believed that he was bodily raised is because the tomb was empty, and over a short period thereafter, they encountered Jesus himself, giving every appearance of being bodily alive once more. So that is pretty powerful evidence for the empty tomb, and the empty tomb powerfully undermines the objection that the disciples hallucinated. One of the powerful reasons for the resurrection that doesn't get a lot of press and people don't often talk about is this simple fact. In 20 BC, there was no such thing as Christianity. In 120 AD, you can't get people to stop talking about the spread and rise of Christianity and the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead. You have paid Roman historians writing letters to emperors, talking about what are we doing with all these Christians all over the Roman Empire. And it exploded. And because of the law of cause and effect, you have to have a big enough cause to explain an effect. So how do you get this dominant belief that Jesus was raised from the dead when in 20 BC there was nothing like that, and yet in 120 AD we can't stop people talking about it? It's a pretty amazing piece of evidence. And as a historian, you can't go, well, just something happened. No, what actually happened? That's a vital thing to explain. Remember, a good explanation explains what needs to be explained. And so, when it comes to this idea, did the disciples hallucinate? That's a common claim, but it's not a strong claim, because we know that you don't have group hallucinations any more than you have group dreams. It doesn't do anything with the evidence of the Apostle Paul. It doesn't do anything to the group appearances of all sorts of people and places and circumstances. It doesn't address the evidence from the empty tomb or this expectation where Christianity and that dominant belief of the bodily resurrection of Jesus takes over, quite literally, the imagination of the Roman Empire in the first century and beyond. So there's powerful reason that Jesus was raised from the dead, and this objection that the disciples hallucinated ultimately fails and is not convincing for those three reasons. I hope you found this helpful. Again, give this a like or a comment or a question on a video you'd like to see, and we'll see you in the next video.